Okay, so I think we can start now. So welcome to this webinar from TestObject and QualiTest, where we're going to talk a little bit about how to automate Appium tests like a pro and how you can work with both the Appium toolkit and the TestObjects toolkit to enable this. So to begin with, who are QualiTest? QualiTest are the world's second largest pure play software testing company. We are only focused on quality assurance and testing, but whether that's functional testing, non-functional testing, it's all we do. We've got over 2,700 professionals worldwide. We're considered an expert in business assurance, results-based testing, managed testing services and solutions. And we've got global services delivery models for onshore, nearshore, offshore crowd testing, and basically finding the right type of testing for you. What is Appium? Appium is a mobile device automation toolkit. It provides functional automation support to Android and iOS devices, and within that it gives you full real device control on native apps, mobile web apps, and hybrid apps. It started as a fork from the successful Selenium WebDriver project, and it's designed to take the Selenium WebDriver testing approaches and apply them to mobile. Appium works on object-based recognition. What this means is if you're familiar with WebDriver, it looks at the model of the web page you're interacting with, and it works based on what are the actual elements of the page shown. Appium wraps up the automation toolkits that Android and Apple provide for developing Android and Apple apps, and provides the same functionality, so it can see what's actually being shown on the screen at the code level. Because it's using the device's own automation frameworks, there's no need to put any specific software or libraries into your application. It enables you to test your app purely as it should be. It's built on widely supported and time-proven foundations. It's taken all the best knowledge and abilities and capabilities from the WebDriver family, and it's tried to apply them to mobile testing to deal with the fact that mobile testing and the mobile apps market is such a huge place at the moment. This gives us the advantage that a lot of the concepts, approaches, experience, and the things that we've learned from WebDriver we can easily reapply to working with Appium tests to give our mobile testing a little bit more of a kickstart. It's also completely open source software, so for a lot of projects there's very little price tag associated with moving across to Appium. What are the disadvantages for it? Well, because it's an open source project, we don't have a great deal of commercial SLA support. A lot of places that need support with Appium tend to go through services and solutions providers who've got a little bit more hands-on experience with it, as opposed to going to something like the Appium project and asking for any kind of an SLA. It also relies on code-heavy solutions. Much like WebDriver and Selenium before it, solutions written in Appium tend to be written in pure source code. So they're written in Java, they're written in C#, they're written in Python. You need test engineers that can write code in order to make Appium solutions. This means that just being a good test engineer is not really enough for Appium. You actually need to be a good developer and test as well. At the moment, it's also limited to Android, iOS, and Firefox OS testing. It doesn't have support for Windows Phone or any other platforms. How does Appium work? Appium basically exposes a very lightweight HTTP server alongside the mobile development company's own SDKs. So in the case of Android, you've got the Android Development Toolkit, and you've got a very lightweight Node.js server alongside it. For iOS, you've got a Mac system with the Apple SDK set up, and the Appium server is set up alongside that. The WebDriver project created something called the JSON wire protocol, which allows clients of all different languages to talk to browsers in a single consolidated API. Appium does the same thing for mobile. What they've done is they've exposed this API through the server to whatever language you like. So as your scripts connect to the server takes those commands and it translates them into whatever the vendor-provided development toolkit says to drive the device. Basically, it's automating via being a piece of middleware between your test scripts and the device under test. All of this relies on the Appium server having a connection to the device. but the connection from the test script to Appium can be remote, although it's usually local. This is all shown here. So we've got the device on the left here, where it's physically connected via a cable to the machine that's got Appium on it, and over here we've got the test scripts that run against it. Most of the time this will be local to your development laptop, but there are also occasions where you can do this via cloud providing, which is a little bit about what TestObjects is going to talk about later. How do we start to write Appium tests? Well, Appium tests can be written in a variety of toolkits because this is all handled via the disjoint client-server architecture. The Appium project lets you write tests in Java, C#, Ruby, PHP, Python, JavaScript, a variety of languages. You can also write your own tests against the server. What you're effectively doing, if you've got WebDriver experience, is you're writing WebDriver tests, but using an implementation of the WebDriver that is for mobile devices. What this looks like from your test automation side is you get a library that provides the functionality to interact with an Appium machine, and you write your test scripts again with functions such as click an object on the screen, tap an object on the screen. All it requires you to do is have Appium pointed to your app and to your device, and have your scripts pointed at Appium, and you'll start being able to interact with physical devices or emulated devices that the Appium installation can see. What are we looking for as we test? I mentioned before that Appium is based on the way WebDriver works, which used to be based on interacting with HTML elements on pages. Well, modern apps are built in a similar sort of way. Modern mobile application interfaces are defined with markup languages. They're XML text files that portray what's on the screen. What we're looking for is where the bits of these files are that denote certain items. So, for instance, which part of the XML file is a button, which part of the XML file is a text field. All of we would use to find these in web pages, we can use to find them in Appium. So we can use things like field identifiers, we can use XPath expressions, text locators to look for things naturally and intuitively as the user works with the page. The only difference between the way we write these for Appium and the way we write them for a web browser is with Appium we need to look for page elements using the device-owned toolkits. The Android tools and the Apple tools have inspectors within them that let you find out the details of what's on the page. What does all this actually mean? I mean, I kind of jumped into some fairly technical stuff quite quickly there. But from a high level, it means that an environment that's already been configured for standard app development that already has things like the app toolkits can very, very easily be turned into an Appium test environment. We can take a lot of the things that we've worked with before, where we've worked with automation on the web functional side, where we've been using WebDriver libraries. We can take a lot of that. We can reuse our frameworks, our experiences, our best practices, and we can take that and apply it again to the way we want to write Appium tests. So things to do with shared frameworks for device interaction or shared frameworks for your specific app. We can reuse that kind of knowledge. This is particularly helpful for things like responsive tests, where you might have one set of web functionality for your website that you want to test still works on your responsive design mobile site. You can reuse a lot of that sort of stuff. From the test engineer's perspective, Appium tests look and feel very like WebDriver tests. So we've already taken a lot of the learning curve out to take people that may have exposure to WebDriver testing to learn Appium testing, and it also goes vice versa. If you've got guys that have worked with Appium tests, it's quite easy for them to then pick up and take what they've learned over to the web testing forum. Few test design best practices. Much like with general scripted functional testing, you need to try and keep your test fixtures and your test logic separate. So we do things like you don't want to write one big script which interacts with every single part of your application. What you want to do is consider your application, break it down into the individual items, so the individual screens of your application, have objects that are solely focused on those screens that you can then interact with those objects. And then if certain pages change, you don't have to rewrite your entire application to deal with those changes. This is a very familiar concept for people that have worked with a lot of web page testing before, or that have worked with screen-based applications testing. This idea of taking what's under the test down, breaking it apart, and it lets us build the tests up more quickly from these parts. and it also means that our systems under test are less likely to break our tests with changes on the UI side. When we're writing the tests, we need to keep our tests high level. If you think of tests as ways of documenting journeys through the system, tests should actually be able to quite clearly explain for themselves what you're trying to do. So for instance, if you're doing tests for a commercial application, you might want to have a test case which simply states, log into the system, search for a product, add a quantity of that product to the basket, go through the basket to the checkout. You don't want to be caught up in your test script itself with all the details of going to the very particular box on the page that is the quantity, of going through selecting a particular color on that test. At the high-level test case, you just want to know the product goes to the basket. What we do is we have our test classes form one higher level area. These are used to document the journey. They call down to lower levels, like those page interaction objects I showed you on the previous slide, or functional units in the middle, where you might have a test class that calls down to a business unit, which handles all of the detail of a login transaction or a purchase transaction. We should also be trying to take our data out of our testing to create scalable tests that are also configurable. So for instance, if you've got usernames, they should be handled in files. You shouldn't be using them in hard-coded in your test scripts. When you're writing Appium tests, you need to make sure you invest in your automation infrastructure. Appium testing is designed primarily for work on physical devices with local development machines. You need to give your developers the ability to run their tests. They need to have the phones near them, the development toolkits near them, and make sure that all of their tests are perfect on their local machine before they check them into things like shared environments or shared test runs where they might affect other people. The faster and more regularly we can get our automated tests running, the faster we're going to find the problems, the faster we drive up the quality. To do any of this, you need dedicated test environments. When we automate from the bottom up. Appium tests are another type of integration test, and if you think of the traditional V model of software, that means that they're middle to high end of the road for complexity. They cover a reasonable amount of functionality, giving a good view of how the middle of the system is looking, but they are quite slow to run, and because of the way Appium infrastructure is, they can be quite difficult to set up. To ensure that when we're running our Appium tests, we're only testing what needs to be done to minimize the turnaround time on these, we need to make sure that we've got good unit test coverage. The test pyramid, as it tends to be referred to, shows that at the bottom we need a good high level of unit test coverage. Then we don't need as many of these Appium integration tests, which are a little bit slower to work with on top of that. There's also the fact that the lower your unit test coverage is, the harder it is for your integration tests to tell you what's actually going wrong with your system. We need to give test developers everything they need to run their tests locally, so they're not relying on shared environments where test failures for them may affect numerous other people. We need to make sure that the software build is chained, so that, for instance, those slow-running unit integration tests aren't going to run if your unit tests have already failed. There isn't much point running the slow tests when we already know from the fast tests that there are outstanding problems with the system. You also need to test your tests. As we get more and more complicated test infrastructure, those tests themselves can be subject to defects creeping in. Complicated test harnesses need to be verified in the same way that code itself needs to be verified for the application. We're going to provide a demo in a minute. Before we do that, I'm going to hand over to Giovanni from TestObjects, who's going to talk about how TestObjects take Appium tests away from solely working on a single laptop and running in the cloud. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the application we're going to be testing. So this application comes from one of QualiTest customers, a company called giffgaff, who are a mobile telco network that are based in the UK. They've been founded in 2009. They had a strong vision of disrupting the market by changing the way a lot of things were done. They are quite firmly built around core values of being lean, disruptive, and driven by the members. There are numerous features that giffgaff has implemented that have actually come from their community of users rather than from the top of the organization saying this is what we're going to do. giffgaff have an app which is designed for their members to keep track of their usage on the phone network. And what this app provides them to do is the ability to view their phone credit balances and allowances, top up their phones, talk to other members of the GiveCAF community, change settings that apply to their account. And what we've done is we've taken a few of GiveCAF's real-world user test cases and we've implemented them in Appium scripts that we're going to show you running. We're going to show you a few of those design considerations before, and then we're going to show you how we can run them in the cloud using TestObject. So the main focus of our test cases is going to be some basic login and logout journeys. And you should be able to see quite easily what it is we're trying to do with Appium and how it empowers us to test the actual physical device and the way the application is as it's shipped. So I think at this point I'm going to pass over to Giovanni from TestObject, who will tell you a little bit more about what TestObject do.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for the concise but very clear introduction. Who am I first? I am test automation engineer at TestObject, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to get Appium right. And after we're done with that, we'll just quickly see how you can run your Appium test in the cloud on multiple real devices at a time. Before we jump into that, though, what is TestObject exactly? So we are a mobile app testing company from Berlin. We offer a platform that allows you to leverage your mobile testing processes. The idea is simple. We provide an extensive cloud infrastructure which allows you to access 200 plus different device models. That means smartphones and tablets, both Android and iOS. What we offer is a manual testing solution for our mobile devices. This means that you can just log onto our platform, and through our web app, you are able to remote control phones and tablets from both platforms. But what we do also, and this is kind of the focus of this talk, is automation. What we do is we integrate with some of the most popular open source frameworks for mobile automation. So we integrate with Robotium and Espresso for the Android side, and of course we have a cross-platform solution that is we integrate with Appium, which is what we're gonna look into more in the detail very soon. So TestObject is the cloud testing solution of choice for many large enterprises which operate in different industries. Now, before we jump into the next segment of our talk, why exactly do we need to talk about how to get Appium right? Well, actually, there's a very simple reason, and you have it before your eyes. In my day-to-day job as a test automation engineer, and I work with Appium most of the time, this is what I stumble into all too often, and I hope you can see the code here. It's basically, you know, just your run-of-the-mill Appium test, and so it's a working test that works reliably too. So what's the catch? So why do we need to look into ways of making this better? Well, there are a few reasons. So first of all, if we look at this code, we can see that we are not using abstraction to our advantage. We have, let's jump back to it for a moment, we have very kind of high-level instructions and low-level instructions all in the same class, things that don't really belong together. Then we have a clear problem with readability. If you have a look at this test method that we have here, and just for the sake of our presentation, imagine that we have 50, 100 tests like these just in this test class and in other classes all around. So if you look at this test, of course, the name of the method itself is not giving us a lot of information. Main screen test, okay. something is happening on some main screen somewhere. So let's see. Let's say that someone has given this code to me, or that I myself wrote it, I don't know, maybe 2 months back. Now I have to understand again what's going on in this method. So if I have a look at it, it seems that we're waiting for some elements identified by the name mindBowProject to appear, up to 30 seconds. Then we're clicking, we're tapping on the back button and inputting some string into a field, then doing a bunch of clicks on different elements. So you see, if I spend 1 minute going through this, I will have a precise understanding of what is happening here. But again, imagine we have 50 more of these. That's actually a huge problem. I cannot spend this amount of time just to understand each time, to rediscover my code each time. And you cannot see it here, but I'll show it to you in a minute from the code that we have prepared for you. This way of writing tests leads to a huge duplication of code. And if you have, every time there's a change in the UI of the application, if you need to change something 50 times, it's way easier to get something wrong, actually, to introduce even more mistakes. So the problem with this script is its low maintainability. So imagine that you are having a working release of your app every 2 weeks, which happens very often in an agile environment. So if that is the case, this is really bad news for you. You have to improve this. Otherwise, maintaining this will cost really too much effort. Okay, so we have the problem. What about a solution? So there are a bunch of solutions. The one that I am the most fond of and the one that I will present to you today is called the page object pattern. So the page object pattern basically is about enhancing your test maintainability by increasing readability and reducing code duplication. So exactly what we're looking for. Okay, but how does this work? And this might sound a little bit maybe too theoretical, maybe it won't be clear immediately, but again, I will explain it to you. We'll have a look at some test code together, and I'm positive that after that it will be clear to you. Okay, so how does page object work? The concept is actually quite simple. Every page in a website, so imagine we're testing a web app or just a normal website, or every screen in a mobile application, this does not make any difference, is represented by a class. So if our application has a login screen, we'll have a class representing this login screen. And each and every one of these classes contains the interactions that the user can have with the screen or page itself. So all the underlying grab that text field and input the string like this for me, all this stuff is hidden and does not appear in the test method itself. So one good thing to keep in mind is if your test method if you're applying page object, of course, and your test method imports WebDrive stuff directly, then you're doing page object wrong. Okay, so this is an image just to give you an overview, sort of what we are trying to do. So what we have at the top, we have a snippet of code that looks more or less like what I showed you before, right? So what we have on the top is just low-level interactions with the UI. And what we want to do is actually, and this would be all in our test method. Keep that in mind. What we want to have in our test method is a set of instructions that are about high-level user interactions with one screen of the application. So not get me the text field for this and the checkbox for that, and then click on this login button. More like, hey, this is the screen I'm on, please perform login, which is basically what goes through people's minds when they are performing a login operation. Okay, so let's say we apply this, and we're going to apply it very soon. What is the benefit? So immediately our tests become more readable. They, as I was saying before, read as a sequence of user interactions on a screen. So we're talking about something that is actually way higher level than the starting code we saw just a few minutes ago. What about code duplication? This, of course, takes care of code duplication as well, because if we are having a problem on one screen, we know that we need to change the code to fix that only in one place. So that makes our life way easier. So now it's time to get our hands dirty a little bit with Appium. So let's jump out of this presentation for a moment and get into our IDE. I hope you can read everything, otherwise I'll just make it a bit bigger for good measure. And maybe, even before we do that, let's have a look at the application that we will be testing. So here I have a device connected. As you can see, this is the login screen for giffgaff, the application that Daniel just introduced. As you can see, we can just type in a username, a password, you click a login button. Now I just, of course, entered some bogus credentials. And what you see here is actually one of the tests that we will show in a second. So our negative test, basically. And you see here we have an error message, and already we know that we can do something. We can check against this, for example. Okay, so let's look at the ugly code that I have prepared here for you. Usually I just live code through this, but since we don't have that much time and we really want to have some time also for questions, for Q&A later, we're just going to jump through some different levels of page object setup, and this is just the pre-page object setup that we're looking at. Okay, so what we have here does not look that different from what I showed you on my first slide. So again, we've got two test methods. Again, imagine that we have as many as you want. We have two very simple scenarios. We are first of all waiting for one element to appear, which is the username field. We're sending in the username, same for the password field, just as you would expect. We get the login button, we click on the login button, and then we wait, in this case, for an element that is supposed to appear on the landing screen after a successful login. So that's what we're checking against. Login with invalid credentials, basically the same, just instead we're looking for an error message which contains the text that we have just seen. So already I was talking about code duplication before. You couldn't see it because I only had one method there, but here you can see immediately what I'm talking about. So for these two scenarios, the flow is actually the same. Okay, we're providing different credentials, but that really doesn't matter. What's important is actually what is in the assertion. So, okay, then we have, of course, a setup method here, which is, again, doing something a bit more complex. So we are initializing the driver, which is what allows us to connect to the Appium server, and then just a one-liner method here, which shuts down the Appium session. Okay, so what if we apply page object? Sorry. Let's jump into our basic page object setup. Where am I? Is it page object basic? Yeah, okay. Probably I didn't click on ID again. Okay, so what happened? Where are we? Actually, we're still exactly where we were before, just things have changed quite a bit. What we did here is we just applied the definition of page object. So we created some screen objects, and look, it looks completely different now. So let's have a look at our login with valid credentials method. Now, how long does it take me to understand what's going on here? Where am I? I'm on the login screen. And what am I doing there? I'm waiting until the login screen itself is loaded. So what happens after that? I'm still on the login screen, and I'm logging in with these credentials. Okay, then what am I checking against? I'm checking that the dashboard screen, so the second screen that appears after a successful login, is active. So all of a sudden, less code duplication and a whole lot more readability. So let's now quickly jump into one of these page objects. Okay, so here we have the class for our login screen. So what's going on here? If you check our login method, well, you have exactly what you would expect from a login method. Here, we're just, again, encapsulating into a single method a more complex user interaction. So we have a username, to which we're providing a username string, password field, we give it the password, and a login button that we, of course, click to perform the login. That's it. In wait until loaded, which is the first instruction in the test, we are just waiting for the username field to appear. And in this method that is used in the negative test, we're just waiting for some text to appear into the dialog, the error dialog. So nothing special here. What's more special is, what's more interesting is here on the top. Some of you may be familiar with these annotations, some not. What we're doing here is just using a neat feature that we have that allows us to basically provide a strategy through which we are going to grab an element from the UI. And this way of doing things, which of course is opposed to the good old driver.findElementBy, this just keeps things a little bit neater. So the nice thing about this, and we're not going to show it, we only have the Android app for GIFGAF right now, but suppose that we were going to, we wanted to really use Appium's cross-platform magic to the max, we could just add another annotation here, which goes like iOS find by. And here we could provide a different strategy, the same strategy, and just here put an ID. And what this does is, based on the type of driver that you have instantiated, automatically select a locator strategy for the element. And that's not even hard to actually get into place. Just if we look at this line, what we're doing is just initializing the Appium field decorator and providing also an implicit wait. Basically, we're saying, hey, get me these elements through annotations, but please wait up to 15 seconds for them to show up before failing. Of course, if we jump into the dashboard screen, we find our isActive method, and again, we still have a little bit of duplicated code, so probably we can do better, right? But before we jump into the next step, let's have a look at this other class, tiny class for now. This is the app class, and all it's doing is basically it's serving these page objects, just so that you can, in your test method, just write app.login screen and have access to everything that you can do on the login screen. So basically, it's providing us the chance to write things like this. Okay, but funny you said there's still room for improvement, so let's find out something about that. Oops, let's just stash all my changes. Okay, so what happened now? We got rid finally of the setup and teardown method that we had inside our test class. And as you can see, we have a hint here where those two might have been moved to. So we jump into this abstract test class. You can see that we just basically we just added one more layer of abstraction. So we have this abstract class. Well, actually, it's not abstract in this case, but it should be, I guess. Okay, and we basically have moved our setup and teardown method here. No big deal. In this case, we have one test class here, but again, for the sake of our demonstration, add a couple more, 20 more, however you want. And then imagine that unless you have some special requirement and you need different kind of setups and teardowns, you can just have them all extend abstract test, which is quite nice. What about the screens? We have login screen again, dashboard screen, and abstract screen. What's that actually? So of course, as you can imagine, abstract screen is where we have put what was duplicated code, and this also should be abstract, I guess. I don't know why that is not there, but okay, maybe later. Okay, so what we have here is actually what we had duplicated before into every single screen class. As you can see here, we were talking about this implicit weight and the Appium field decorator just a moment ago, and then a whole bunch of content actually, because what we have here is basically all the low-level kind of user interactions that we can be sure that are shared between a whole bunch of screens. So here we have implemented a method to swipe right or to scroll down and all this sort of stuff. Okay, that's nice. Can we do even better? Actually, yeah. So let's check out page object advanced again. Stash first. And here we are. So instead of passing our login credentials in our test method, what we're doing now is we have a credentials class. Actually, I think it's an enum that is serving the credentials that we have in a property file here. So, of course, if the solution that you want to use really depends on what you're testing, what you're doing, how much stuff you need to fit into there. So, if you just have a couple of accounts, you could just as well create an enum here, just paste them directly in the code, and if you have quite a simple setup, that might work for you. But if you have a lot of data, actually, I would suggest a property file. So apart from that, so that also makes it look a little bit cleaner. But what else has changed? So what we have changed again is, and actually this property helper that you see here is what we will use then to go and get our credentials from the property file. What we have changed here is the way that we set up our driver. So we have a new class here just for convenience, and you will see it gets more convenient later on actually. We have basically a builder class that allows us to just quickly build a an Appium driver for the specified platform. Here we could just go in and write for iOS against a certain endpoint. Here we would be running just a Appium server here on our machine, but that's not what we're going to do, because we can do better. And then, yeah, you just build this and you get your Appium driver. So now I think just a few things have changed here in our screens. We are trying to make everything as tidy as possible. Here, for example, we have our method in which we were checking against an error message. Here again, we have more or less what I was talking about before. And again, this is not entirely something that you need to do. This is something that you can do when you have a bunch of error messages and you want to test against them, check against them, sorry. Okay, so what now? What can we do to make this even better? Of course, we can jump to our latest branch, and with just a few modifications, we can run this in the cloud against real devices. So just how does that work? Is that hard? Well, not really. So here we have a Java JUnit setup, as you've seen. What we have developed with TestObject is a way to integrate with JUnit. We have our own custom JUnit runner, and this allows you to easily select a bunch of devices on our platform and run your Appium test against them. So here again, we have just made some minor changes to our Appium driver builder. So we're passing some extra capabilities, and these are actually provided right here on top of our testing class. We could do it with environment variables, but in this case we have our stuff just pasted here on the top of the class. Here you can see we're using our custom JUnit runner. So what do we need to do on TestObject? Well, it's easy. You just register an account, you upload your application. In this case, we have, since we're working on Android, we have our GIFGAF APK file. Would have been IPA if we were testing an iOS app. So we just create a project here, and here we just jump into Appium. We create a new suite, and when you're creating a new suite, you can control which version of your application you're testing against, which Appium version you're testing against. Again, the Appium server is on our side. You don't need to have it running locally on your machine. And here we have a whole bunch of devices. So I say, okay, now that I've written all these nice tests, I want them to run on this Asus ZenFone 5. And then maybe, I don't know, let's go up. And of course, we provide a nice title. So webinar test, I guess. Let's say I really like Motorola's. So I have Motorola Moto G. Let's get this one and that one, and then save. Okay. What do I need to write in the code, actually? I just need to provide an API key, which basically authenticates us to TestObject and tells TestObject which project we want to test against. Then I need an Appium URL, which is, well, basically just the endpoint at which you can find, again, the Appium server on our side, and a suite ID. So now, again, if I go back, I can see that this suite that we've just created has ID 7. We have it here in our annotation. And so let's see it. Okay, as you can see here, we did not have to specify these devices inside our code. basically what we did is we asked, hey, TestObject, I want this project and this suite. What devices are selected for that suite? And here we get our devices being allocated, and then we're checking if everything is fine with the device, if the device itself is clean, and if everything is good to go. So now, if we jump into our webinar test, here we have the first run. We can jump into the Moto G. We see our test methods being run. Okay, we just actually jumped in just in time. This is a live view of the execution. What you see is happening on a real device. Here we're inputting some bogus credentials again, and clicking on login, tapping on login, and we are waiting for a error message to appear. Okay, it appeared briefly, but got it. And now we will get the report that the test succeeded first in our IDE. Yeah, as you can see there, Moto G real, first test succeeded. And here in a moment we will get, okay, we will get a report that tells us that our test execution was successful, as you can see from the icon here. And so what do we get from this? We get a fully detailed test report for our Appium test. And what we see here are basically all the details that we need to understand what happened and what device we were running on, which application we were running on, what we were running and how it went. And then we have screenshots. We have a video. Video is actually when I'm seeing how my tests go, this is really the thing, of course, that allows you to get a feeling for what happened, what went wrong, what went right, just the quickest way. But if you need more details, you can see also the requests that were sent to the Appium server. So you get a little bit more detail. You can get the full device logs and, of course, the Appium logs themselves. And this is kind of the the deepest point to which you can get to really see on the lower level what really happened. So what we have seen, we just started with a very simple low-level test. We basically went step by step through the page object implementation, starting from just applying the let's say page object definition. We moved past that, introducing more layers of abstraction, and then we leveraged TestObject to our advantage to run on multiple devices in parallel. So before we move on to the Q&A, before I forget, I just wanted you, since you've now seen TestObject, if you want to try it on your own, we will be giving out a coupon for a 1-month free automation plan that all the participants to the webinar will receive soon. So I guess we have some time for questions now.
So we've got a couple of questions have come into the questions box, and I don't know if we're going to get a chance to go through all of them, but we can certainly go through a couple of them. So one of the ones we've got here is, does the TestObject Cloud also support hybrid Cordova apps with Crosswalk plugin? I think that might be one for you to answer, Giovanni.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'm not entirely familiar with this plugin, Crosswalk plugin, but what I can do right now is I can show you my screen again. And if we go here just to the next slide, you can probably see my contact on the right. And so please shoot me an email so that we can look into this further. Also, this goes to everyone else who has more questions. And so since I guess I see there are quite a few questions, so we probably won't be able to answer them all.
So we've got a question here. We mentioned that Appium is multi-platform. How do test automation engineers go about writing tests for both Android and iOS? We ran the tests through the IDE. Is it possible to take this a step further and run them through the CI? So the first part of that, how do you write tests for both? Depending on how your app's put together, if you've got a cross-compiled app, you might be able to get, or a mobile site app, you might be able to get away with one set of page objects and you just need to change your driver. That would be more common with mobile web and hybrids. For native apps, you'd probably need a separate set of page objects for the iOS variant and for the Android variant. But what you do is your driver would be configured to use you return a different driver which platform you were testing against. And if you've got your page objects designed well, your test cases and your business layer, so the test case is obviously the high-level login object, go and do the login, the business layer is the login page object, populate this field. Those two layers shouldn't need to change purely for if your page objects are designed well. Your driver would just have to return the right page objects to interact. As for the can you run the test through the CI, yes, you can control Appium via build scripts, so Maven, Gradle, all that sort of stuff. And where you've got CIs with plugins like that, you can use those in Appium too. So you can use Appium with those too.
Yeah, if I can add something here. So it's been in my experience, it may be that so if you get lucky, you can also use a single page object for both native iOS and Android applications, but that really depends. So of course you will be using these annotations that allow you to, okay, so that's the cleanest way maybe, not the only way, that allow you to switch based on the kind of driver that you have instantiated between different strategies. So you've got an iOS strategy and an Android strategy. But as Daniel was saying, this is not always the case, and so in theory you can write, it is possible to write a single script for both platforms, but this is not a given, of course. One thing that I always try to stress is that if the flow of the application is completely different or still seriously different from one platform to the other, and that happens, then it also doesn't really make sense to try and go crazy and write one single script. In that case, in my opinion, it is just more straightforward to go with two separate ones.
Yeah, I think we're starting to cross into test design, but I guess one way of thinking about it is if you've got something like a cross-compiled app, so where you've got one code base, you'd probably find it easier to reuse your page objects. But if you've got two completely separate native applications developed by different teams, you probably need to consider, do you actually need a separate suite in general? We've got another question here. Can you access the device itself from the client, put it into airplane mode? That's a straightforward question, but not necessarily a straightforward answer. So because Appium is using the device automation toolkits, things you can expose through the device automation methods, you can get to in certain ways. So a good example, if you're familiar with Android development, is you can control things like ADB shell commands. and you can control apps that are pre-installed on the device, but that's not necessarily the same as saying you can simulate everything you can do on the device. It's a bit of a gray area. Yes, there are things you can do outside the control of your own app, but it starts to make the automation more difficult to do, and I'm not sure how suitable some of those things would be on TestObject's cloud.
Yeah, that would, so for what we do is for these kind of setups, we offer actually a private cloud, and then we study feasibility together with the client, try to understand more or less what the requirements are and how we can make it happen, even though it's something more complicated and unusual. I see two easy questions that we can answer real quick. Where could I see the code? Well, if you shoot me an email, I am again Giovanni Rago, and I will show you again my email address at the end of this session. Then I will point you to some page object examples that you can find also on our help page. Then second easy question is it possible to get the recording of this webinar? I think we are recording the webinar right now, so we will make it available to all our subscribers, to all the attendees, as soon as not only to the attendees, but all the people that registered, as soon as we have this, as soon as we upload this, basically.
Okay. Can you run tests needing two devices? Again, you can do it if you start separate instances of Appium, but I don't think that would work. I'm sure Giovanni will correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if that will work on TestObject's cloud unless you also had two separate suites against the cloud. Would it?
Yeah, sorry, I'll jump in. This is actually something that we have done. It's been one of the actually more interesting projects that I've worked on. Yes, we can do this. We did this for basically at a set of private devices. This means devices that are accessible only to one client. And through, of course, things get more difficult if you do this sort of thing. It requires a lot more work, but it's feasible and it's been done. And it was actually exactly a chat application. So kind of a weird chat application with lots of also asynchronous stuff and stuff that was a bit harder to test, but yeah, it was two devices chatting, and yeah, it's doable. Then I think this is all still a question for TestObject. Is it possible to upload my tests to your cloud and execute them on your infrastructure? So if we're talking Robotium and Espresso, then that's how it works. So you just upload your test APK along with your app APK, and you run the test directly. You have a the old nice old play button that you can just click and fire off your test. If we're talking about Appium, though, not really. So we're just because of how Appium works, we're talking client server here, so things are a little bit more complicated. Still, what you could do and what most of our customers do, because of course so we saw how to run a test through an IDE against TestObject, but this is of course not how you want to do things most of the time. What you can do is actually just do some CI integration, and we've got some plugins out for Jenkins, for example, and what you're doing is just running your test through Jenkins, passing maybe some environment variables with your API key and whatever you need to provide for your test, and then the test gets run with TestObject basically with just one click. So I don't know if this is what you are asking for, but it's maybe an alternative. Which one is more effective, fast responsive when coming to automated through Appium, Android or iPhone devices? So here I'll say Android. So what we found is that when testing on Apple devices, for some reason, the devices are just slower in executing the commands because there is a sort of delay that has been introduced by Apple there in their native automation framework. We're not sure why this is, but at least in my experience, this is definitely the case. So Android definitely more faster in responding. Do you share my opinion, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, it's the difficulty of the question is really how powerful is the device itself. But it's also unfortunately one of those things you can't really control because you're relying on the vendor-developed gear. Yeah, I think you've pretty much covered the rest of it off, though. You can find and click buttons, text, etc. currently seen, but there are different resolution. If there's a button on a different resolution but not on the screen, do I need to write test? So my experience with Appium and where it does deviate from web page test models is with a web page, it doesn't matter if what you're trying to get to is not visible, with the exception of a few JavaScript quirks. That's not always the case with Appium tests. You may need to implement scrolling logic, but there are a couple of methods built into the Appium framework itself, one of which is scroll to text, which are designed to help you get to elements that are currently out of visibility. But yeah, you do need to implement navigation for off-page elements. I'm not sure if that still applies with the iOS devices. Does it, Giovanni?
With iOS devices, for what I know is you definitely need to have the element on screen. So again, yeah, scroll to would be the way to go.
I think there's another one here for test objects. Can we control the version of the app under test on the cloud? For instance, automatically upload a new application if the version is changed?
Yeah, actually we have, if I understood the question correctly, we have also some plugins that help you do this, also Gradle-based plugins. You can check our help page, actually I don't think we had the link here on our presentation, but again, just shoot me an email and I will point you to the right tutorial so that you can get this up and running.
Yep.
Can you use, sorry, go on, Daniel. So can you use TestNG with TestObject? Yeah, you can use TestNG with TestObject. We currently do not have in place something like you saw before. So basically a suite setup that just allows you to select the devices through UI and not have to, choose them in your code. But that's hopefully also coming soon. We already have some TestNG tutorials on our help page too.
Is TestObject open source / free?
No.
Do you? I think that might be a relevant question for a few people. Do you have any details of your pricing to hand, or is it a per quote calculation, Giovanni?
So if you go to testobject.com/pricing, you can see all the pricing for yourself. Of course, for special kind of setups, like we were saying before. So if you need if you either need okay, so we also offer on-premise installation, but that's another thing. But also, if you're looking for something more than just the public cloud, you want to have your own private pool within TestObject. then usually you have to ask for a quote. Yeah, but definitely check out our pricing page, and I think we also have the contact from our sales team there. So definitely shoot them a question if you want to know more. I see one. Do you have any way to interact with physical devices? So I'm not sure if I understand this correctly, but so TestObject actually is only physical devices. We do not provide emulators. So we do.
We've got one here. Can you integrate Appium with Cucumber? So to the best of my knowledge, there is no direct Cucumber library binding for Appium. But it's, as I mentioned in my slides, there are Appium drivers available in most of the major languages. So if you can find a Cucumber binding for your preferred language, whether it's Cucumber for Java or you want to do Appium with Ruby, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to use that, but that would require some custom setup on behalf of the engineers. Do you have visual automation services? I'm assuming you mean look and feel validation and coloring. I'll let you handle that one, Giovanni.
So I think, if I understand the question again, I think not really. So we do just pure functional testing. So so if it's just about where automation, how can I say that? How it fits in with something that's more about the look and feel of the application. What we have actually quite some customers doing is doing semi-automated tests in a way. So, for example, let's say that I have a responsive website. What I can do, because you can also do web testing through Appium TestObject. What you would do is just write a simple test that goes through all the pages of your website on, I don't know, 10, 20 devices, whatever you need, and take screenshots every time after scrolling. What you can do is actually, instead of manually having to navigate through every single page and scroll down and check everything, you can just check a bunch of screenshots and see if something catches your eye immediately.
I'm just looking through here, and I don't think I can see any questions that we haven't looked at. There is one more TestObject specific one. Is it possible from TestObject to test an app uses services for pre-production environments, maybe using tunnels or services or something similar? I'm assuming from that question you mean things like, could you use an app using fake payment gateways or fake membership gateways that belong on site?
Yeah, you can. This again needs some more attention to get properly set up. But I know we do this, and yeah, it is supported. What I see here is actually another question. Unfortunately, I probably don't have the answer that Volkmar is waiting for. With Appium 1.5, it is not possible to find elements with the property name anymore. How can I locate elements by their label now? So I would say, unfortunately, due to the projects that I've been working on lately, I couldn't really give 1.5, could not really play with 1.5 as much as I would have liked to. But I've also noticed this, and it was also kind of weird for me. So I'll get back to you on that, because I also want and need to find the answer for this, because of course it's nicer to interact with elements through their IDs, but let's face it, sometimes this is not enough for one reason or the other, and you need, let's say, lower level, dirtier methods in a way. So yeah, find by name is one. Yeah, I do see any more questions. We still haven't.
Two at the bottom. I'm just reading through them now.
Okay. is there any way or tools to test performance on real devices? Maybe Daniel knows about this. I can tell you that on TestObject we don't offer performance testing.
Yeah. So this there's two ways to look at this question, if you can drop me an email afterwards, Sergey, you'll see my email address is on the next slide as well. I can talk to you about that a bit more. I think it's a little bit outside of the scope of here, but it ultimately comes down to trying to test how the device performs or something that uses devices performs. But we can, I think that might be a little bit beyond the end of this webinar.
Yeah, maybe let's take the last one, because I think we are way past the 1 hour mark.
Yep.
Okay, when I have used Appium with TestObject, one time I have run into an issue, which is any one of the device selected in the suite is missed in the result. Is it because the device is already in use by another client? Yeah, so what may have happened is, if you did not get access to the device that you selected, this means probably the device might have gone into maintenance after you selected it. So what happens is, working with real devices can presents a unique set of challenges, because you have everything from strange stuff that's going on just on this one model, because things are handled differently due to the slightly different Android version, and this also changes from manufacturer to manufacturer, all the way down to all the more down-to-earth issues like, hey, the battery has exploded. So yeah, sometimes we try to have devices always available for our clients. Sometimes, unfortunately, some really have to undergo maintenance, and then we intervene and try to bring them back to full health as quick as possible.
I think that's probably about all the questions we're going to have time for. There are a couple I can see that have been missed. Feel free to email myself and Giovanni afterwards, and we will go over these individually. I think that's probably about it. I just want to say thank you very much again for attending. I hope you found this very informational. Feel free to contact us with any other questions. And thank you, Giovanni and TestObject, for sharing us a little bit about your system as well.
And thank you, Daniel, and to QualiTest for joining us for this presentation. And of course, for all the other people who joined this webinar.